You're listening to the ISF podcast for your organization's better cybersecurity. Your host, ISF CEO Steve Durbin, is an expert in leadership, business culture transformation, and cyber strategies for today's top enterprises. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Today, Steve is in conversation with Kathleen Perley, founder of DemystifAI and faculty and AI advisor to the deans at Rice Business. Kathleen explains why leadership matters when implementing AI in your business and shares how to bridge the gap between tech-savvy CTOs and non-technical folks. Kathleen and Steve also discuss the possibilities and boundaries of artificial intelligence.
Hello, Kathleen. Lovely to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited about this.
AI, that's what we're going to be talking about. And there's probably not a podcast show in the world that doesn't have somebody at the moment talking about AI. It's one of those things, isn't it, that everybody seems to know something about, yet the majority still don't know very much. And I'm hoping that the next 20, 30 minutes or so, we can at least shine a little bit of light on exactly what is the possible versus the impossible or the not quite yetable. Tell me a little bit, though, about how you got into the whole area of artificial intelligence, because that wasn't how you started out life, right?
No, I mean, I think it really is. You never know what journey the decisions that you make in your life will take you. And at some point, there seems to be this convergence where things seem to somewhat align. I actually was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD at a young age and was told, especially on the dyslexia side, that I probably shouldn't go to a four-year college, that it just wasn't in my cards. And being a little stubborn, I said, not only am I going to go to a four-year college, I'm going to study linguistics and figure out why and really truly grasp language and understanding like the weirdness of spelling and all the things that had challenged me for years. And so I focused on linguistics and really understanding that aspect of it and really seeing language as almost a code, if you will, because I was always good at math and terrible at language. And so I turned into a math problem. And so how I got into this space was really falling in love and really wanting to truly grasp some of the things that were a challenge for me, which is why I studied linguistics. I then went to Madrid, where I did a Fulbright on linguistics, phonetics, phonology, and second language acquisition. And when I moved home, my goal was to go and get my PhD and really stay in that field. My mom had other plans because if I lived in her house, I had to have a job. She was a true New Yorker through and through, and I love her for it. And that's where I got into digital marketing and advertising and really some of the actual coding of programming languages. And it started to align with my background a bit. I was like, oh, instead of coding and decoding language, I'm decoding and building websites and writing schema. And so these different experiences really all culminated for me once AI became more democratized and it didn't cost an arm and a leg to build models from the ground up. And we were doing Vertex AI in 2016, building propensity models for healthcare marketing and advertising. And so it's just been a true joy to kind of see it come full circle and had that exposure. And I'm not an engineer. And I think what I really want people to understand is for you don't have to be anymore. AI has gotten to a point where the most powerful coding language is English. Right. And there's a huge opportunity for people with different backgrounds or experiences to unlock the potential that some of the developers or engineers might not have because they don't have the depth of knowledge in an industry or a sector or a challenge.
It's a very positive way of looking at AI. I think all too often people fall back on it's going to take away all of this opportunity. It's going to mean that we're going to lose so many different jobs. But from what you're saying and the way that you're viewing it, it's much more on the opportunity side than anything else I'm hearing. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I will tell you, when I teach at Rice and my students in the grad program, I tell them throughout my course, if you don't have at least a couple sleepless nights where you get a little bit of an anxiousness, right, about the unknown in terms of job displacement, things like this falls into the wrong hands, that should be a concern. But there's such a bigger upside in terms of opportunity that I think oftentimes is overlooked. And so you have to balance the promise with the peril of it. But it's something that really excites me. In one of my courses, we focus on building what I'll call AI mini wrappers or little mini agents. And these are for non-technical business students. So they don't have any coding background, but we show them Claude Code and N8N and how to integrate with APIs and things of that nature. And one of my students built an AI agent for her nephew and was her final project. He's autistic and he was about 16 and wanting to date.
Right.
So she created an AI avatar so he could practice small talk and dating. And like that would not be something that would be the first thing that came to mind for me. But her experience and her background and understanding what AI could potentially unlock created something that could really serve a population. And that's what gets me excited. Now, that's probably very emotionally appealing.
Mhm.
I had another student who was working for space travel, and he was identified that one of the biggest challenges that they could overcome was that if there was an issue on the ISS, when they call down, they have to find the manual. The items up there are older technology, and the people who built it are either no longer working because they've retired or they're no longer with us. And so he really developed this strategic plan because the other class I teach is a strategy class and a strategic road mapping class on utilizing those manuals on-prem, hybrid on-prem in quotes, solution so that people at the ISS can use that interaction first without having to wait for the time delay between the International Space Station and Houston. And he got approval to move forward on the project, and his boss gave him a grant to follow through on it. And his boss mentioned to him, if we can unlock this issue around life-saving equipment in space using AI to help guide failures to key elements in infrastructure, this helps us go to Mars because one of the biggest challenges is the communication delay.
Yeah.
And so you start to hear these types of stories and people unlocking these ideas. Now, one was from a personal experience, another one was from a deep work experience in terms of what the unique challenges were. But this opens up so many possibilities.
The thing that strikes me listening to you is not just the enthusiasm you have for the space, but also the fact that in the instances you've been referencing there, people have come at it from, I would say, something of they've been personally invested in the examples that you've given. On the one hand, because it was a nephew, on the other hand, because this was a particular interest that somebody had. And so I think it's easy for people listening to this to understand how we could take a technology like AI and apply it into that scenario. The piece that a lot of people talk to me about these days that executives are still struggling with, though, is how do you ensure that you're going to get a return on the investment? Because, in some of those smaller examples around the use of AI, okay, there's perhaps not a huge amount of money being invested in it. But I know of a number of organizations that have thrown themselves into, we've got to have AI. This is going to be the answer to all of the challenges that we've got. And they're struggling now to actually be able to demonstrate some kind of return on the amount of money, and not just money, but also people resource that's been invested in all of this. Any sort of advice you've got for people in that space?
I use a framework in my book that I think is really valuable. And I think, you look at the research, McKinsey just came out, and I think the stat is astonishing, right? 19% of AI pilots have KPIs tied to them. Like 19. So there's 80% of AI implementation going on with zero benchmarking to understand, is this successful or not? In one way, I would say is first and foremost, don't look at it like a technological rollout. Really start to think about it as a strategic initiative and really align to some of the challenges or objectives you have today. And is AI the right thing to kind of help carry it forward? Don't get distracted by the shiny objects and think about what is the value creation from this and what is that possibility? And then put a number to it, create that benchmark. And sometimes that means you have to start benchmarking what you're doing today. So you can see the efficiency gain if that's what you're going after. Typically, I don't think that the efficiency gain is really where the value, the true big value ROIs are coming from. But I do think the efficiency gain is an easy way to get your feet wet from a leadership perspective and a strategic rollout perspective, and then really start to prioritize. So one organization I've been working with, they were an advertising agency. And like many organizations, RFPs is a part of how they grow. Now, they tend to be very cumbersome and very time consuming to complete. But the contracts on the other side of them tend to be north of 2 million, even on the smaller ones. The issue this organization was facing was if we were able to complete 10 more RFPs a year with our current win rate of RFPs of 60%, that would mean this much in additional revenue. Now, did it end up being 60% or did it drop to 40? But then you start to put a line in the sand so that you can start measuring it. And when you start putting numbers in terms of value creation, and sometimes it's a little bit of gut, just putting a stake in the sand just to get going and really start to prioritize. So I typically have a spreadsheet, nothing fancy, but then you can see, okay, what's the value creation of this pilot or this potential rollout? What is the change management impact? What are some of the security risks? What are some of the horizon? Is it a quick win? Is it a moonshot? Really trying to identify, because you need to keep that in mind as well. And so really treating AI like you would any other initiative within your organization.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because if less than 20% are reporting some form of, meaningful business impact, to your point, that means that 80% simply aren't. Why is that? Because you've just articulated a very simple way of measuring the effectiveness. So the question has to be, why is it that 80% are not doing that? Is it because they're all starry-eyed with this new technology, or are they being completely fooled by the tech guys who, traditionally don't like to have their feet held to the fire in terms of the return on the investment, with all due respect, of course. But what is that actually telling you about the way that we're viewing some of these projects?
I think it's funny. I've been working on this research, just thought process around this leadership challenge that we're seeing today. And one of the things that really struck me that came out of the McKinsey report was organizations implementing AI and having success have about the biggest correlation is that they have CEO involvement in their governance,
right,
and kind of oversight of how that all lands. So when you think about it from that perspective, I think part of the reason why AI implementation is failing today is a leadership issue. They're maybe unsure of this technology, don't have what they feel like is appropriate technical background to navigate it. And so they've completely delegated it versus really leaning in and learning the technology themselves, with just enough literacy, not building neural networks, but just enough to have a conversation,
right,
and to think about it strategically. And so I think a lot of these companies that are not tying things down to KPIs are doing it because they're either implementing AI because they're feeling pressure from their board or from their competitors.
Mm-hmm.
So they're chasing. And so it is very much so not necessarily being implemented from a strategic perspective from the get-go.
I mean, I can relate to that at the ISF now. We've been working with AI for about the last 3 years, I think. And certainly in the beginning, I was hugely involved. I had this sort of vision as to what I wanted certain projects to try to do, certain business problems that I wanted it to solve. I was heavily invested in the beginning. And I suppose I got to a point where I realized that we couldn't take it much further without having some fairly strict governance.
Mm-hmm.
You need the transparency, you need to cover off the ethical issues, you need to understand where the data is, how it's being used, all of those things. But then once I think those sort of building blocks are being put in place, I tended to step back out of it, relying on the people involved in the projects to just get on with it and to let me know how things were going. So I can relate to the challenge that other CEOs are facing in that space. The only thing I would say is that, again, hindsight being a wonderful thing, to your point, I probably should have stayed more engaged through some of the middle ground.
I will say, I think a lot of CEOs are delegating it from day one. I think there's a difference from delegating with that continued oversight from a strategic perspective and slowly pulling yourself out over time and still staying within it in terms of bringing ideas to the table or encouraging some of that conversation.
Yeah.
But what I see oftentimes more than not is a lot of executives joining this conversation saying, my board has told me I need AI because it's going to help us from a valuation standpoint. It's going to help our stock move. Our competitors are doing it. And if we don't, we might be behind. We have to do AI. Now you go and figure out what that looks like completely and let me know, right? So I think there's a balance between the two. And I can understand, right? I think a lot of individuals, tech and business, have been kind of seen as, from a standard industry perspective, as like a silo. You had business folks at the helm and you would have tech folks elsewhere, where I think you're really needing to build a blended skill set, a unicorn, if you will, in terms of not necessarily needing to code, not needing to know those aspects, but truly understanding that a model's output is dependent on the data that's been used to train it and some of the algorithms. So if you're having issues with the output, is it a input issue or is it a data issue or an algorithm issue? not needing to know the specifics of it in terms of how to find out which one it is, but knowing that these are the places where failure could happen.
Yeah. I think the other thing I'd add to that, where I've certainly found a change, I suppose, over this sort of 3-year period was and I think a lot of the people within our business, we simply didn't understand what the capability was of the tool set. And has to be said, that has moved so quickly over a similar sort of period of time. My advice to anybody listening to this who on the business side is you have to stay involved, because otherwise you're not going to see how it can change.
Yeah.
And you're not going to be able to ask the right sort of questions and reposition, because in my experience, it's been a constant repositioning of what we've been trying to achieve.
100%. And I will say, like, on using that framework that I mentioned, right? Put notes in and say, here's this harebrained idea. Right now, the tools aren't consistently capable of being able to deliver on X or Y, so that you have that. So once a new release comes out, like, oh, wait, this one thing that somebody had a harebrained idea of might actually be plausible. Do we need to reconsider it? And I think, two things oftentimes that people miss is they're utilizing AI to integrate into their existing processes.
Right.
Versus thinking about how do we adjust our existing processes to unlock the full potential of AI. And I think that oftentimes means that you're going to see a more global organization due to the ease that AI has with a lot of the language aspects of things. And one thing that I have been encouraging organizations to do, and sometimes I will tell you, I get a bit of a fantasy look when I first suggest it, that I'm like living in fantasy world, is having a team that's focused on, like, a small team, not a large team, that thinks about what would we do when AGI is achieved or ASI is achieved, and what does that unlock for us? And I'll give you a prime example. As I mentioned, one of my classes is a strategy class, and I had a student who actually was a former zoologist at the New Orleans Zoo. Rice has great MBA students, and they come from all different walks and backgrounds. And it's funny because I come in with a certain level of experience and I'm like, I have no idea what the first thing about veterinary care at a zoo, but it is fascinating. She was talking about leveraging AI to help triage so that pet owners didn't have to go straight to an emergency vet after hours and trying to navigate some of those pieces. And she mentioned, I've been trained for years so I could help train the model to identify what are critical aspects versus non-critical. We talked about that. And one of the questions I have my students kind of grapple with is, what would your organization or your strategic roadmap look like? Or what are some considerations for when ASI or AGI is achieved? She was in my class in the spring of 2024, so May 2024, a little over a year ago. She, mentioned a few other things. And I said, well, did you consider what if the models could decipher barks or meows or the language of animals to interpret what was wrong? And she kind of laughed and she's like, considered it, but I thought I was crazy if I ever mentioned it. And then you look recently, and there's a study out of France where they're, I think, 95% accuracy able to detect the needs of cats through their meows. As I mentioned, not a veterinarian and haven't been able to really look at it from a usability perspective, but it's becoming more and more of a reality, and it's been a little over a year.
Right.
And so I think having some folks focus on that is a huge opportunity.
I think the other thing about AI is there's absolutely no shortage of opportunities. I suppose we're still at the point, aren't we, where the limit on what AI might be able to do is probably the human brain rather than anything else, because we are thinking along fairly traditional lines. And I think that trying to work in collaboration, if you like, with AI will certainly open up very many more opportunities that are out there. But Kathleen, I wanted to talk about your book, because we've alluded to it a couple of times. You've just come out with this book. It's called AI Made Simple, probably a hugely appealing title, I would imagine, for quite a lot of people. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so I wrote the book really in part from my students, as they would leave my course invigorated, excited, and then they would say there's no understanding at the executive level of what's going on. And I want to be able somehow ensure that we're all speaking somewhat of the same language. And so I created the book first and foremost for my students and then for their colleagues. And what I've found is that so many people are just intimidated by the language itself of AI. And so how do we remove that? The book is developed for non-technical executives and really looks at creating that literacy of AI so that you can have a conversation with your engineering folks and technical folks about how this all works and understanding what some of the business challenges or objectives are with that, along with ethical and legal. And then really, how do you strategically implement that within an organization? and really providing those frameworks in terms of how do you build a new organization? What does the new org structure look like? How do you build the toolbox, the governance? How do you really rethink your business strategy? And I use a lot of real life examples. And so it's funny, I was actually talking to a good friend of mine. We work together. He's the CTO of a big organization. And I joined the call and he's like, I'm reading your book. And I was like, oh no, you're a CTO. You're going to think this is so silly. And I was like, be brutal. What are your thoughts? He's like, honestly, I find it a funnish read. And what it's helped me more than anything, because he's super technical, I now have the analogies and the frameworks to talk about it with non-technical folks, which wasn't necessarily the intention of the book. It was intentionally meant for non-technical executives and business leaders who wanted to understand the space more. He's able to use it almost in the reverse.
Yeah, and I think the thing that struck me about it was that you've tried to cover off most, if not all, of those real sort of thorny topics, some of which people hear about ethics and some of the legal concerns. But you also get into some of the talent management issues as well, which I think is hugely important, because certainly from a security standpoint, we're always banging on about the fact that there isn't enough talent and how do we manage it appropriately. And so how do we then balance out what it is that systems can do versus what people can do. So I thought that was pretty useful. And then I think there were also some of the more sort of real examples and some of the practical frameworks that you touched on as well that just made it come alive more. So I found that I could relate to it. It answered some of the problems or sort of questions that I had in the at the back of my mind.
I started my life really in a way where I felt like an outsider, right? I had to leverage technology to help me. I remember getting my first electronic dictionary and how amazing that was. Because before that, I was building the skill set of the speed at which it took me to look up a word in a dictionary and trying to get under 45 seconds, which today is completely useless. But I've always had to think about things in a different way to make them digestible and understandable for me. And the way the world would present them to me in terms of the traditional formats would just never seem to work. And so I took that approach with this book, not knowing, to be honest, if it would resonate with anyone or just my brain for the most part. But I think it has resonated, which has been really good to hear, because it's really about removing, as I mentioned earlier, the intimidation and really being able to understand the impacts. You mentioned a little bit about the talent side of it. And you look at the stats of if you have AI skills, and I'm not talking building, but leveraging these AI tools in terms of skills, you're 70% more likely to get hired. Those individuals are garnering about a 56% wage premium right now. All of your A players, if you're not leaning into AI as an organization, are going to start looking elsewhere because they know that they need those skills and that exposure for their own career development. It's not only imperative from a competitive business perspective, as you start to see the consumer expectation shift as well, but you're also going to have to really think about this from a talent perspective, because your employees are understanding that this is critical for them to learn to grow in their own career.
Yeah, and I think that the other piece that I'd pull out in the book is the final piece, which you call the strategic horizon, from adoption to transformation. That was, I found, to be a really fascinating piece. And again, just encouraging me, I think, to just think slightly differently and moving on from the here and now and some of the challenges that people are obviously facing into, if we can actually get this right and look at how that strategic transition from some of the more operational things to really transformational ways of working could unlock a whole range of different opportunities. That's the fascinating piece, I think, with all of this, isn't it?
The two things that get me the most excited and why I teach this is, one, I'm an entrepreneur through and through. So there's a bit of that. And I think AI creates the biggest entrepreneurship opportunity of our lifetimes. So that gets me very excited. The capital needed to do your own startup is lower. Information becomes more accessible. And so that really excites me. But then on the other side is this strategic transition and this almost transformation and disruption. And, I'm not a true academic in nature, right? Although I wanted to be from day one. I spent a good chunk of my career in the workforce. Is rethinking how we look at business. And I'm not talking about having robots be the ones taking your orders or things of that nature, but I'll give you a prime example. And it's something I was talking about with some folks at Rice recently in the business school, is when you think about agents and agentic frameworks and having what we'll call it model processing memory and capital that's created, how do you look at that from an accounting perspective? Because if these agents are able to learn from each other and build this kind of layer of intelligence or knowledge, is that a capital asset?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do you govern it to ensure that it is still truly valuable over time? And does that change how we look at depreciation? Obviously, today, the US GAAP accounting laws don't recognize it, right? So you'll start to see further book and market value gap. But is that something that changes over time? And so when you talk about and you start to think about not necessarily robots, but how do we rethink assets when it comes to accounting? How do you rethink supply chain? We've had all these, whether it's lean or Six Sigma, and how do you rethink that given our two biggest constraints moving forward will likely be computing, chips, and then energy?
Right.
And then do you start to integrate this idea of cognitive switching as a potential quote unquote bottleneck? I don't have all the answers. Obviously, I'm not an accounting expert nor a Six Sigma lean expert in supply chain, but I think there's a ton of opportunity for people who have a lot of depth in that background to bring that experience to the new ways of working and seeing even those types of transformations take place.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And certainly when I looked at the book, I think it was probably one of the first books I've actually come across that didn't try to bamboozle you with technology, but did try to straddle that tech and business, the two separate worlds, which I think everybody has to do if we're going to make a success of AI. So, Kathleen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about all things AI and certainly the book. I would certainly encourage people to take a look at it. Presumably it's pretty easy enough to get hold of on all of the normal ways.
Amazon is an easy way to get a hold of it, or you can reach out to me and I can make sure you guys get a copy.
Fantastic. So it was lovely talking to you, and thanks so much for sharing some of those insights.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
Special thanks to this week's guest, Kathleen Perley. We'll be back with another new episode next week. In the meantime, if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and we'd be pleased if you'd consider sharing the episode. To become an ISF member, get in touch with Steve directly at steve.durbin@securityforum.org or on LinkedIn. Check out all our media and resources. All of it is there to support you at securityforum.org. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox Productions and Tavia Gilbert. Thanks for listening.